Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of In Bed with Books, the bookish podcast for bookish babes. I'm your host, Melissa, and today we are going to be talking about the latest book in the Hollow series, Demon's Bluff, number 18. This is all by Kim Harrison. So, if you've been watching the podcast or listening to the podcast for a long time, you've almost certainly heard me talk about these books. I love these books. I've been reading them since I was too young, definitely a teenager. I don't really regret having started them young, if I'm being honest. So I was very excited for the series to be continued. Little context for anybody that doesn't know or isn't familiar with the series. It seems to, and I keep saying this, I don't know that I've ever actually fact-checked this. I think there was just it's entirely possible there was a long pause between book 13 and book 14. Book 13 very much was the series finale. It closed down the stories, everything got wrapped up. There was an epilogue, which, as far as I can remember, and I'm on the side doing a reread of the main series, hadn't happened previously. So when they restarted with book 14, when Kim Harrison brought that out, several years ago now, I was, of course, ecstatic because inner teenager Melissa finally got a reboot of all of this. And one of the biggest, I say issues, not with the writing, but just one of the biggest heartbreaks in the whole series, one of the biggest problems, just because it happens, was the death of a character. Now, having said that, let me clarify that this episode will certainly have spoilers. So if you haven't read the book yet, or you're only partially through the series, do not continue. Bookmark this, come back to it later once you've caught up, or once you've just accepted that you want the spoilers and you're okay with that. But that being said, partway through the original series, one of the major characters died. And I will just say the name because, one, you've been warned, and two, it is a major plot point for this book. So early in the series, Rachel, the main character, had been dating a vampire, which was and is kind of very touchy for her. Within this series, within this universe, the Hollows universe, vampires are there's this dynamic that Harrison really, really digs into with vampires and with their bloodletting, if you want to call it that. It's very detailed, I should say. I'm trying not to get into it too deep into the weeds, I guess you could say. Basically, it took a lot for Rachel to grow, to get to a point where she could date a vampire of this power and of this, I guess when I say power, I mean political power within their city, but then also just somebody that powerful. And he's so good. He was so good. He's a kind character. And so it really breaks your heart when he dies. And she did all of his character growth, and they were very, very much in love. But of course, it's a 13-book series, and so somebody's got to die. I think one of the big concerns that I had going into this book was, one, I knew it wasn't exactly a secret, but we knew that we were going to meet Kiston. That's his name, Kiston again. So the setting for all of this is that Rachel is desperately trying to find the counter curse for a curse that she kind of accidentally cast. Rachel cast the curse on purpose, but what it did was not fully explained to her on purpose, because whoever gave this to her, which I won't get into, I'm not going to give everything in the series away, it was an attempt to get her arrested for illicit magic. And now she's desperately trying to find the counter curse. And there's this last material that she can't find, and because Rachel is the way that she is, she's decided the best option is to actually go back in time to try and find the ingredient, because the person who was last known to have the ingredient has since gone out of commission. And so she adapts this like, not illicit curse to take her back in time, accidentally goes back to the night that Kiston, God rest his soul, dies. She was meant to go way farther back, but true to form, not everything goes according to plan, and she accidentally brings a little hitchhiker along, and in the process, now has to take care of this very entitled Elyse, more on her later, and also try to figure out if she can accomplish what she needed to about 3 years earlier than she had planned. My first really big plus for this book, and I think this ends up being the plus for almost all of Harrison's books that I've read so far, is her grasp on characters. And usually, or I shouldn't say usually, but I guess in the past, with the previous books, what we see is Rachel accepting her friend's help and seeing like the best way for her friends and her to work together. Rachel herself as a character is strongest with her friends, and so I think that on its own breeds a book in a series and like a universe where we have such in depth and such like fleshed out characters. I don't know that I've read a series that has it this well. And I mean, again, this is book 18. So by this point, that makes sense for her to have such like clearly defined characters. And so it's fun that Harrison is using them. And in this book specifically, she's not using them. There's this like the absence of Ivy for a lot of the book, the absence of Jenks for a lot of the book, the absence of Trent for a lot of the book, really, really emphasizes these very specific holes in Rachel's life as she's trying to accomplish these things. And I enjoy a lot the fact that each character, after all this time, it feels like the book wasn't the same without them. And I just can't fully articulate the weight that that's holding as well. It is just like these essential parts were missing. And the narrative itself is very aware of that. It's a very conscious choice on Harrison's part, because Rachel throughout the book is lamenting that absence. I think what that does as well, after 18 books, it can get very tired. You can have, certain plot lines or tropes get repeated over and over again, and so you have to do something to, and I don't want to say jazz it up, because it's not just about Harrison jazzing it up, it's about Harrison reminding us just how important each of these core characters are. And in a book where she's bringing back somebody from the dead, which had the chance of wasting his death in terms of plot growth, and it's like, well, what's the point of dying then if you can be brought back? One, it was not easy to bring him back. There were so many hoops that she had to jump through to bring him back. And two, she's very conscious of making that decision and how she can make that decision in the most ethical way. And that hasn't always been the case. Not that she's ever, Rachel has for the entire series been so ethical, to the point early on where I was reading and I'm like, oh my god, I forgot how anti-smut, black magic she was early on, until later on down the line when she realizes, oh, it's not as clear-cut as everybody thinks it is. And so I guess what I mean specifically by how ethical her decisions are, there's this point very middle of the series, I want to say it was, where her friends and her are all defending against people attacking the house. And at the very last second, she suddenly starts to regret the spell that's about to happen to defend their home, and everybody that they care about. And she tries to stop it. And in trying to stop it, it kind of explodes on all of them. And I guess that's what I mean is sometimes I think by this point, what she's realized and what she's as a character seems more aware of is the fact that once you set something in motion, you can't always stop it. And so how does she move forward? So again, she's doing this going back in time spell. She's kind of adapted a couple of curses to make it work for her without killing her on the way there or on the way back. And in the process of the initial, like, going back in time, Elyse, I can't remember her last name, Elyse, who is the head of the Coven of Ethical Standards within this book, kind of piggybacks onto it, not knowing what the spell is going to be, and thinking that Rachel's just trying to, like, hurt her. Rachel knows that she has the power to work around this. And so immediately she just kind of goes into a different kind of problem-solving mode. And so I really liked that growth from her. And maybe it was just so obvious because it's such an obvious connection. Before I get too far into Elyse, though, something else that I want to discuss is Kiston himself. So, again, a concern that I had going into this was that somehow it would undersell or, like, suddenly devalue his death within the, you know, the timeline, the context of the series and Rachel's growth as a character. Not that I think that characters need to die for other characters to grow, but that's just a byproduct of characters dying. Harrison handled it really tactfully, I would say. She kind of introduces the prospect of us having to run into Kiston, and then a little while later it's like, oh, we've run into him, but, you know, do we know what's happening? He doesn't really seem like what we know is going to happen. And then in each individual meeting, through, you know, kismet, through happenstance, even until almost the very end, Rachel is insistent that she's not going to try to bring him back. She's just got to let things play out. But through all of this, she's reiterating the same thing that we know, which is that we didn't see Kiston's body go, and we don't actually have any proof that the ashes that Ivy and Rachel have had for the last 2.5 years are actually Kiston's. So from the beginning, we're kind of set up with the idea that this very well could play out with Kiston coming back to the future with her. But it's the how is that going to work out kind of thing. How is she going to manage that? Everybody keeps telling her, well, you can't just use the resurrection spell every night. And at that point, you're like, if you know Rachel, if you've read all the previous 17 books, you know that she's going to find a way around it. You know that she's grown enough as a person and as a witch, and at this point as a demon, to not have to resurrect him every night. She will find a way around. Her understanding of magic at this point is just so far beyond anything that anybody else ever expects from her. She thinks so far out of the box. I love her as a character. Sorry, I'm gonna keep just like lamenting her intelligence if I don't stop myself. Another reason that I think Kiston's return is so well executed is because, going back again to that, like, the absence of friends and her allies in this narrative, in this book specifically, we're seeing the very specific holes that each of these people leave when in their absence in her life. In having us lose all of her allies, all of her friends in the narrative in this specific book, we also have the opportunity for her on her own to engage with Kiston, which I think would be very different than if she was with Ivy and she saw Ivy being Ivy there, because Ivy's response to seeing Kiston would have been entirely different as well. In that situation, Rachel would have to be the logical one. If Jenks was there with her, Jenks would be pulling Rachel out mentally. He'd be pulling her out of the trenches there. So I think it was necessary, even at that point, to have her be alone. Because if she was with Trent as well, we know that she loves Trent. And I love that Harrison has us reminded of that several times throughout, because that was another concern that I was having, is we're just going to have Kiston, who was the love of her life, come in while she's almost certainly on the edges of being engaged to Trent. And don't get me wrong, I love Kiston, but at this point she's built a life with Trent, And I don't think that, I guess, scratch that, reverse it. I think Rachel at this point is too powerful of an individual for Kristen. Their dynamic is completely changed. So I appreciated that it didn't go down the route of, well, I have to try with Kristen again. It's like, you don't, actually. As much as I love Kristen as a character, because he's very emotionally intelligent, and that becomes extremely clear when we're having the conversation in the bar with him. It didn't need to be a case, and it wasn't a case, thank God, of trying again with Kristen and then just going back to Trent or something along those lines. And then I guess kind of like a third product of having Rachel alone is the fact that we really do get to see her ingenuity and her power just on its own. She is very capable. She's just not afraid to ask for help in other books. And the biggest way that I think we see that is with her and Elyse trying to get along. Elyse, for so much of the book, was insufferable. And she's supposed to be insufferable. She constantly does not trust Rachel. And she's constantly, like, almost betraying Rachel. And she says one thing, but then she does another. And it's because she's been raised as this, like, bratty, almost coven member. So she's entitled. She thinks that she is the most powerful person in the room. She doesn't know how to not, like, blast entire buildings just to get her way. Not recognizing that, you know, most people don't appreciate having things blasted out of a building. And so I think it was a great comparison for us to see Rachel, who is far more powerful than Elyse, but far more restrained, like recognizing that the people that they're interacting with on a daily basis or on a regular basis outside of some of their fights, and even just in some of their fights, are just normal people. There is no reason that they need to go shooting black curses all around. And Elyse doesn't show any restraint because she doesn't think that she has to. And she also, even when she's in the same room as Rachel, thinks that she is the most powerful person in the room. The only things that she's actually scared of are demons. And she doesn't seem to recognize that Rachel is one, even though she's using that against Rachel. So I love that we get to see that even though, yes, Rachel is far more powerful than she was at any other point in the series, she just kind of gets exponentially more intelligent as a witch, as a runner, as just a human, I guess not a human, as a person, as like an individual. Her intelligence, her emotional intelligence is so much further now than it was at any other point. And if you had any concern as she gets more powerful about it going to her head in any kind of way, this just proves that she is grounded. Towards the end of the book, Elyse does eventually trust her. She does mind games and decides, oh, I guess Vivian was right about you, I can trust you, as if every other action that Rachel had done up to that point hadn't just proven that. But I digress. She does eventually trust Rachel, and she decides, Rachel, when we get back to the future, I am gonna convince the rest of the coven to not charge you. We'll do a vote, but they vote with me, and Rachel's like, you are not gonna get the vote that you think you're gonna get booted out of that coven. And Elyse is so convinced still that she's not gonna get kicked out of the coven. And what happens when they get back? Exactly what Rachel said would happen, which is that Elyse presents the vote to exonerate Rachel, and the others are like, fuck that, no. So I just love how that really emphasizes the fact that Rachel has come far, but she hasn't lost her empathy. A lot of the series covers or discusses topics of power in terms of like magic power, and in the same way that other books and other series talk about the way that like political power can go to people's heads, or, you know, like business, any people in positions of power can sometimes lose those parts of themselves. And I think this is one of the reasons that I love this series so much, is that the more powerful Rachel gets, the bigger her heart gets, and the bigger who she considers her family and who she needs to protect gets. She's never been about stepping on the little guy. And I will continue to read the books as long as that continues to stay true. A few things. This is the first episode of 2025, so we are officially in a new season. This was the last book that I read. As of now, which we're just shy of 2025 as of recording this, and I don't see myself finishing the book that I have on my shelf currently reading, which I think puts me at 21 books for the year out of the 30 that I had planned. Not my best year so far, but not my worst, and I have to remind myself of that. For this year, I'm gonna try to really get down and be a stickler about my release dates. I'm gonna try to get back into book reviews to keep me accountable. The next few book reviews that I have lined up are gonna be actually some arcs that I've been reading, which I'm very excited to talk about. I have one by PC Cast that has been actually very much of a joy to read so far. If you are ever interested in getting arcs, I know I talk about them fairly often on the podcast. My favorite go-tos for romance, fantasy romance, are NetGalley and Book Sirens. Book Sirens, I think, does more self-published, but don't quote me on that. If you do sign up for NetGalley, I can't remember who said this online, but make sure you have yourself as a reviewer and not as media. If you put yourself as a media setting category, then they're gonna assume you work for an official big publication. So like me, I'm a reviewer. It's just me on the podcast on In Bed with Books. Yeah, so I think that's all I have for you today. I've got some exciting stuff planned for 2025, and if you liked the bookish chat series that I had with Kristen, we are planning to do a little something else, a little mini series as well for this year, which I don't want to spoil too much of, but it is also related to PC Cast. That's all that I have for today. Make sure to hit the subscription button if you'd like to see more of this, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you for joining me for another episode of In Bed with Books, a bookish podcast for bookish babes. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of the latest updates. And if you have any suggestions for authors, books, or topics that you want to hear about on the podcast, then feel free to DM me on Instagram or shoot me an email. I'm wishing you a lovely rest of your day, and until next time, happy reading.